There is a kind of work that most people have done maybe a handful of times in their entire life. Work where time disappears, where the noise of the world falls away completely, where every cognitive resource you possess converges on a single problem with a focus so total and so effortless that hours pass in what feels like minutes, and what emerges at the end is something genuinely better, genuinely more creative, genuinely more valuable than anything you produce in the fragmented, distracted, perpetually interrupted state that most people call their normal working life. And that kind of work has a name, it has a neuroscience, it has a psychology, and it has a specific set of conditions under which it reliably occurs. And today we are going to go completely inside all of it, because understanding the psychology of deep work is not just professionally useful. It is one of the most personally transformative bodies of knowledge available to any person who wants to close the gap between the quality of thinking they are currently producing and the quality of thinking they are genuinely capable of producing when their mind is operating at its full, undistracted, fully resourced capacity. Let's begin with the concept itself. Because Cal Newport, the computer science professor and author who coined and systematized the term deep work, defines it with a precision that is worth sitting with. Deep work is professional activity performed in a state of distraction-free concentration that pushes your cognitive capabilities to their limit and creates new value, improves your skill, and produces output that is hard to replicate. Every word of that definition matters, but the phrase that matters most is pushes your cognitive capabilities to their limit. Because this is where the psychology of deep work connects directly to the neuroscience of cognitive performance, and where the difference between deep work and ordinary work stops being a matter of preference or productivity style and becomes a matter of what the brain is actually capable of producing under different attentional conditions. The human brain, when operating in a genuinely focused, single-task, cognitively demanding state, activates a configuration of neural networks that is qualitatively different from the configuration it operates in during the fragmented, multitask, frequently interrupted state that characterizes most modern knowledge work. The prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of executive function, abstract reasoning, creative synthesis, and every form of high-level cognitive processing that produces genuinely valuable intellectual output, operates with dramatically greater efficiency, depth, and creative capacity when it is sustained on a single demanding task than when it is asked to rapidly switch between multiple tasks or to maintain focus while managing the continuous low-level cognitive load of monitoring incoming notifications, emails, and social media updates. This is not a subjective observation. It is a neurological reality with measurable consequences for the quality of cognitive output, and understanding it at the biological level is the first step toward treating deep work not as a luxury or a preference, but as the fundamental unit of meaningful cognitive production that it actually is. Now let's examine what is happening in the brain during genuine deep work. Because the neuroscience here is not just fascinating, it is directly prescriptive, meaning it tells you not just what deep work is, but exactly what conditions your brain needs to enter and sustain it. When you successfully enter a state of deep, focused concentration on a cognitively demanding task, your brain undergoes a specific pattern of neural activation that neuroscientists have begun to map with increasing precision. The task positive network, the interconnected set of brain regions responsible for directed attention, working memory, and goal-directed behavior, achieves sustained dominance over the default mode network, which is the neural system responsible for mind-wandering, self-referential thinking, and the kind of unfocused mental drift that characterizes shallow cognitive states. This sustained task-positive dominance is not the natural default state of the human brain. The default mode network is, as its name suggests, the brain's default, the state it returns to whenever external task demands are insufficient to maintain task-positive activation. What this means practically is that deep work is not achieved by simply deciding to focus. It is achieved by constructing a set of environmental, physiological, and behavioral conditions that provide the task-positive network with the continuous stimulation it needs to maintain dominance over the default mode network for extended periods. And the construction of those conditions is itself a learnable skill, not a personality trait, not a genetic endowment, but a capacity that develops through deliberate, consistent practice in the specific way that any neural capacity develops, which is through repeated activation of the relevant neural pathways under conditions of progressive challenge and adequate recovery. One of the most important and most misunderstood aspects of the neuroscience of deep work is the role of myelin, the fatty sheath that wraps around frequently used neural pathways and increases their signal transmission speed by a factor of up to 100 times. Every time you engage in deep, focused, cognitively demanding practice in a specific domain, every time you push your thinking to the edge of your current capability and sustain that push for an extended period, you trigger myelin production in the neural pathways relevant to that domain, making future activation of those pathways faster, more efficient, and more automatic. This is the neurological mechanism behind expertise, behind mastery, behind the seemingly magical fluency of thought that characterizes truly exceptional performers in every intellectual domain. It is not that their brains are fundamentally different from yours. It is that they have, through thousands of hours of deep, focused, cognitively demanding work, literally built a different physical brain with faster, more efficient neural highways in the domains where they have concentrated their deep work practice. And here is the profound implication of this for anyone who wants to develop genuine expertise in their field. Shallow work, fragmented, frequently interrupted, cognitively undemanding activity does not produce myelin. You can spend 40 years in a profession doing shallow work and never develop the neural infrastructure of genuine expertise, because myelin production requires the specific combination of cognitive demand and sustained focus that only deep work provides. This is why the person who spends 5 years doing 4 hours of genuine deep work per day will develop expertise that the person who spends 20 years doing shallow work will never approach. Not because they are smarter, but because their brain has been given the conditions it needs to physically restructure itself in the direction of mastery. Now, let's talk about flow, because the psychology of deep work is inseparable from the psychology of flow, which is the state that psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent 4 decades studying, and which he identified as the optimal human experience of engaged, absorbed, effortful activity. Csikszentmihalyi's research, which involved sampling thousands of people across dozens of cultures and professions at random moments throughout their days and asking them to report their mental state and activity, found something that seems paradoxical until you understand the neuroscience. People report their highest levels of enjoyment, engagement, meaning, and psychological well-being. Not during leisure, not during rest, not during the passive consumption of entertainment, but during states of active, effortful, skill-testing engagement with challenging tasks. In other words, during deep work. The conditions for flow that Csikszentmihalyi identified map almost perfectly onto the conditions for deep work that Newport describes. A clear goal, immediate feedback on progress. A challenge level that is slightly above current skill level. Enough to require full cognitive engagement, but not so much as to produce overwhelming anxiety. And the elimination of distraction sufficient to allow the attentional absorption that the flow state requires. The psychological consequence of regularly achieving flow through deep work is not just better output. It is a fundamentally different and richer experience of your own working life, because the brain's experience of time during deep work is compressed in a way that makes effortful, demanding intellectual work feel not like sacrifice or obligation, but like genuine engagement with something real, something challenging, something worthy of the full deployment of your cognitive resources. And this experiential richness is one of the most powerful and least discussed arguments for developing a deep work practice. Not just that it makes you more productive or more skilled or more financially successful, but that it makes your intellectual life feel like something worth living, like something that engages the full depth of your humanity rather than skimming its surface. Let's now address the enemy of deep work. And I want to be more precise about this enemy than most productivity content is, because the enemy is not simply distraction in the generic sense. It is a specific, named, thoroughly researched cognitive phenomenon called attention residue, which was identified and documented by organizational psychologist Sophie Leroy at the University of Washington, and which is one of the most practically important and most widely ignored concepts in the entire psychology of cognitive performance. Attention residue occurs when you switch from one task to another before the first task is fully complete or fully cognitively resolved, which is to say, it occurs virtually every time you respond to an email in the middle of a work session, every time you check a notification while writing, every time you attend a meeting, and then immediately attempt to return to the deep thinking you were doing before the meeting started. When you switch tasks, a portion of your attentional resources, your cognitive attention, does not make the switch with you. It remains partially allocated to the previous task, processing it in the background, maintaining a cognitive thread that prevents your full attentional capacity from being available to the new task. And the more unresolved, the more incomplete, the more emotionally or cognitively charged the previous task was, the larger and more persistent this residue becomes, and the more severely it impairs performance on the subsequent task. Leroy's research found that the quality of cognitive performance on a task is significantly lower when that task is preceded by an incomplete, switched away from task, compared to when it follows a fully completed task, which means that the modern knowledge worker who is continuously task switching, responding to messages mid-thought, and attending meetings that interrupt extended thinking sessions is not just failing to do deep work. They are actively degrading the quality of every cognitive effort they make through the accumulated weight of their unresolved attention residue. The solution is not just to block out time for deep work. It is to ruthlessly protect the boundaries of that time, to resolve or deliberately park ongoing cognitive threads before entering a deep work session, and to understand that even a single mid-session interruption resets the attentional state in a way that requires significant time and cognitive effort to recover from. Research by Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine found that after an interruption, it takes an average of 23 minutes for a person to fully return to a complex cognitive task. Which means that in a work environment characterized by continuous interruption, most people are never actually doing deep work at all. They are doing an endless series of interrupted, shallow attempts at work that never achieve the attentional depth at which the best thinking occurs. Now let's talk about the specific psychological practices that reliably enable and deepen the deep work state. Because this is where the neuroscience and behavioral psychology converge into practical guidance that can be implemented immediately, and where the difference between people who occasionally stumble into deep work and people who reliably produce it on demand becomes most visible. The first and most foundational practice is the development of what Newport calls a deep work ritual, a consistent set of environmental conditions, behavioral sequences, and temporal boundaries that the brain learns to associate with the transition into the deep work state, and which over time becomes a reliable trigger for that state through the mechanism of context-dependent memory and conditioned neural activation. Your brain is extraordinarily context-sensitive. It learns to associate specific mental states with specific environmental and behavioral conditions through the same basic associative learning mechanism that Pavlov demonstrated in his classical conditioning research. And this means that if you consistently do deep work in the same physical space, at the same time of day, preceded by the same preparatory behaviors, your brain will begin to enter the deep work cognitive state more readily and more completely in response to those contextual cues, reducing the startup cost of achieving focus that most people experience as the first 15 to 30 minutes of frustrated, wandering, shallow thinking before genuine concentration finally settles in. The startup cost is real. Neuroscientists call it the induction period, the time required for the task. Positive network to achieve sufficient dominance over the default mode network to produce genuine focused attention. And every practice that reduces this induction period multiplies the effective deep work hours available to you, because a 45-minute nominal work session with a 20-minute induction period produces only 25 minutes of genuine deep work, while the same 45-minute session with a 5-minute induction period, achieved through consistent ritual and contextual conditioning, produces 40 minutes of genuine deep work, a 60% improvement in cognitive output from identical time investment. The second practice is the management of cognitive load before and during deep work sessions, because the prefrontal cortex's capacity for sustained attention is not just depleted by active distraction. It is depleted by the passive maintenance of unresolved cognitive threads, pending decisions, and open loops that occupy working memory even when you are not consciously thinking about them. David Allen's Getting Things Done methodology, whatever one thinks of its implementation details, is grounded in a psychologically important insight. The mind is for having ideas, not for holding them. And every task, commitment, or unresolved question that you are attempting to remember rather than record is consuming a portion of your working memory that would otherwise be available for the focused thinking that deep work requires. The practice of conducting a complete cognitive offload before a deep work session, writing down every pending task, every unresolved question, every open loop that your mind is tracking, has been shown in research by Wharton psychologist Zachariah Sherrick and others to significantly improve subsequent focused performance because it frees the working memory resources that were occupied by maintenance of those open loops and makes them available for the demanding cognitive work of genuine deep thinking. The third practice, and this is the one that most directly shapes the long-term development of deep work capacity, is the deliberate training of the attentional system through what we might call attention endurance building, which is the progressive extension of focused work sessions, in the same way that an athlete progressively extends the duration and intensity of their training load. The brain's capacity for sustained focused attention is not fixed. It develops in response to demand, exactly as physical endurance develops in response to progressively increasing physical challenge. The person who currently cannot focus for more than 15 minutes without their mind wandering does not have a broken attentional system. They have an undertrained one. And the path from 15 minutes to 90 minutes of genuine sustained focus is not a matter of willpower, but of progressive, consistent, patient practice that gradually builds the neural infrastructure, the myelinated pathways, the strengthened prefrontal connectivity, the conditioned task-positive network dominance that extended focus requires. Beginning with sessions that are challenging but achievable, extending them gradually as capacity develops, treating the wandering of attention not as failure, but as the essential training stimulus that makes the practice productive. This is the methodology of attentional training, and its long-term yield in terms of cognitive capacity and deep work output is one of the highest return investments any knowledge worker can make in their own professional development. And now, let's arrive at the final and most psychologically profound truth about deep work. The truth that transcends productivity and professional performance and touches something essential about the human experience of a meaningful life. Cal Newport argues, and the psychological research broadly supports, that the capacity for deep work is not just a professional advantage, it is a form of human flourishing, a way of engaging with the world that produces meaning, craft, and the specific kind of satisfaction that comes from doing something genuinely difficult with your full capability rather than doing something easy with a fraction of it. The craftsman, the surgeon, the musician, the mathematician, the writer who disappears into their work and emerges hours later having produced something genuinely excellent. These people are not just more productive than their distracted counterparts. They are more alive in their work. They experience it as something worthy of their full humanity rather than something to be endured at minimum cognitive cost. And in a world that is moving with extraordinary speed toward the automation of shallow, routine, easily replicable cognitive tasks, the capacity for deep, focused, genuinely creative, and analytical thinking is not just a competitive advantage. It is increasingly the definition of what human cognitive work is, what it is for, and what makes it irreplaceable by any system that cannot replicate the specific quality of attention that a fully engaged human mind brings to a problem it genuinely cares about solving. So, the question this video leaves you with is not, how do I become more productive? It is, what would become possible in your work, in your thinking, in your sense of your own cognitive capability, if you gave your mind the conditions it needs to operate at its genuine depth, consistently, deliberately, and with the understanding that that depth is not a gift given to a few, but a capacity available to all, waiting not for permission or talent or the right moment, but simply for the decision to protect the time, eliminate the distraction, and do the hard, quiet, extraordinarily rewarding work of thinking as deeply as you are actually capable of thinking. Subscribe for more mind secrets.